Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, friends. Um, the title of this session is New Age, and it turns out that New Age means very different things to different people in different disciplines and so on. So we'll let our panelists here define what New Age means to them as well as they present their work. My name is Giridhar Rao. And I've been associated with the festival here for the last 10 years. It's a pleasure to return from Bangalore, where I live. Our panelists today in this session are, to my right immediately, Lynnette Lounsbury from Australia, and Filipa Martins from Portugal. There's information about them briefly in this booklet. Does anyone not have the booklet here? Oh, everybody does. Pages 9 and 13. So you're welcome to have a look at the work, the brief descriptions there of what they've done, why they're here. To give as much time as possible for them to speak, I'll hand over the mic now to Filipa first. The format is about 10 or 15 minutes of talking about their work and perhaps reading out a page or a paragraph or two, whatever, from their work that they would like to share with us. And then Lynnette will do the same, and then we'll open up for discussion, questions and answers. Does that work? Yeah. Okay. May I request Filipa?
Thank you so much. Everyone is hearing me? Okay. First of all, of course, I would to congratulate the Hyderabad Literary Festival for its 10 editions. I would like to address all my applause to Professor Vihat Kumar. Oh, it's there. And his amazing team and the lineup of excellent speakers attending this year. I know it looks like a self-compliment, but it's not. We are being witnesses of meaningful discussions about dance, literature, cinema, music, politics. It's a very, very eclectic program, and I'm really happy to be here on these days. This day it's a particularly important day for the country. And I'm happy. I'm very, very happy to be here. So I have prepared a little speech. It's not about my work as a writer. It's more about an idea of literature that I have. If someone can understand what I'm saying, please just stop me and I will repeat. It's just a few pages. So. The meaning of this meeting is huge when today there are too many people who believe that literature is simply not important. Underestimate its ability to resist the test of time and give us great knowledge. We are witnessing the long and steady decline of literary reading. Someone could argue that there are a lot more products and platforms competing for our attention today. That the new generation is digital native, and so what? If you are reading less Tolstoy or Saramago, my Nobel Prize, or Tagore, your Nobel Prize, and filling that void with Facebook status from our friends and online articles. Is there a problem with this? It's a question. The answer is yes, there is a problem. Why? The main reason is we need literature in order to connect with our own humanity. All literature helps us address human nature and conditions which affects all of us. Let me tell you a story, a personal one. I grew up in the suburbs of Lisbon, the Portuguese main city in the 80s, after 40 years of dictatorship. At that time, the suburbs were growing very, very fast. People were leaving the countryside to try a better life in the city, but the main reason for the expansion of the suburbs were the migrants and people from former Portuguese colonies in Africa that had just gained independence through war. At that time, in Lisbon of the 80s, an architectural trend arose. People started to close the balconies, creating closed balconies, of course. We used to say that it was to increase the indoor space, but in fact, we were erecting steel and glass walls between us and the outside. Hygienic ways of observing the others from a safe distance. In other words, as Rabindranath Tagore wrote, our world had been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls. We started having steel and glass between our eyelids because our eyes were no longer balconies, and so the space inside our houses didn't increase. This architectural change, very common at the time but of the dubious taste, was nothing more than a metonymy of the way we thought at the time. Portugal was learning to live in democratic freedom, and a lot of fears were growing at people's hearts. For example, we had for the first time official criminal statistics. The newspapers' headlines were no longer subject to censorship. Portugal is the second most peaceful country in the world nowadays, but free information was something quite new for us, and an artificial fear grew. Fear of the other, of anything different, of what we didn't know, of what came from outside. We saw the unknown as a threat. I remember my parents often forbade me from playing on the street. Maybe it's a paradox. You live in democracy, but you have afraid of meeting the other. Although I was from the first generation born in freedom, my childhood was very domestic. I used to spend a lot of time in my room, where I managed to create a universe of mine. As all children, I used to have a lot of questions, and most of the answers I found were through literature. Literature was always been widely celebrated in Portugal, and I have the legacy of great writers. One of those great writers was, of course, Fernando Pessoa, a poet with a narrow relationship with India. A poet who wrote about a new India which does not exist in space because it's made of dreams. I'm nothing, I shall never be nothing, wrote Pessoa. I cannot want to be anything. Aside from that, I was within me all the dreams of the world. That it's a curse of a writer, having within all the dreams of the world. Good writers and good books have a deeply human capacity. A good writer has a future that makes us all good human beings, which is the ability of otherness, the ability to put ourselves in the place of the other. When you write a story and you create characters and you work on the consistency of these characters, you need to be able to put yourself on the character's shoes. And that makes us better human beings, the ability to think and accept a different way, but certainly also make us better readers and better writers. This capacity is also acquired by reading and must be obviously be at service of writing. Recent studies have demonstrated that fiction boosts the quality of empathy in the people who read it. Their ability to see the world from another person's eyes. And good works of literature, particularly novels, can grant you direct access to other person's minds in a way that few other works of art can. So, if you are reading less literature, it stands to reason that we may be becoming a less empathic world as a result. If changing reading habits are indeed making us less able to see things from other people's point of view, that could have drastic consequences, like hate speech. Literature has no fixed meanings, and perhaps in today's world, It can set the clock of humanism and point out directions. Literature resides on the capital instant, on the paradox of never having a beginning or an end, an escape from life that becomes less alive and therefore less human, underlines the importance of literature, because it's when there is no time that you should most make time for literature. In the same way that our principles become even more important in times of dire need. Literature is where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world was not been broken up into fragments narrow domestic walls, where the mind is led forward by the into ever-widening thought and action. Into that heaven of freedom, said Tagore, your Nobel Prize, let me my country awake. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that deeply human account of literature and its place in our lives. Thank you so much. Would you like to read a paragraph also from your work, and then
Yes,
we move to
I can
Lynnette?
manage.
Is
yes. Just the introduction. If
yes,
you don't
please.
have the
text,
the paper, and you can find the page number. The page is? Okay, the page 9. My name is Filipa Martins. I'm a Portuguese writer. I'm a novelist. I have written 4 books, all in Portuguese, but I'm negotiating right now the rights to the UK market in English. I'm a scriptwriter also and a journalist in Portugal. I'm reading in Portuguese a small paragraph of the book. Everyone understands Portuguese, of course. No, I'm joking. And then we'll translate. Okay. Just to be to see how Portuguese looks like. So, my novel's title is Na Memória dos Roxinóis, who means the memory of Roxinóis. Roxinóis, it's a family. It's a Galician family of mathematicians. They work during the Nazi regime, but something happened, which I will not reveal. So you have to read the book. And they stop using a number 7, in their work of cryptography. So because of that, the Nazi Germany suffered a huge defeat, something that helped the Allied forces to winning the war. So as Haruki Murakami used to say, memories warm up you from the inside, but they also tear you apart. So in the case of my book, the memory was like a curse for my characters. But because of that, the Nazism have been defeated. So sometimes memory is a curse for a human being, but save all humankind. No. So let me read. Nasceu para ser número primo. Do you want to translate at some time? Or after me? Ok. Nasceu para ser número primo. Jorge Rossignol nem sempre foi Jorge Rossignol. Até 5 de agosto de 1945 era o 7, um número primo. Jorge foi o 6º neto a nascer e o avô Rossignol, matemático galego próximo de Franco, apenas decorou os nomes dos primeiros 5. Quando Jorge nasceu, desperto e sem chorar, fitou o avô com os seus olhos cinzentos espelho, que até aos dias de hoje pareciam as águas de 2 bacias que devolvem ao mundo o que o mundo lhes dá, mas num tom mais sombrio, ou como Jorge dirá, mais realista. O avô viu-se refletido nos olhos do neto e, talvez pelo seu narcisismo, concedeu que 6 era pouco para a importância absoluta daquele recém-nascido. Saltou um algoritmo e atribuiu-lhe a posição 7, um número primo. Sinal de reconhecimento de que este era apenas divisível por ele próprio ou pela unidade. Traço de personalidade que cedo se manifestou em Jorge Rossinol. Não ter outro divisor natural, ser ele a única referência do seu sistema de medida.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you. Among the pleasures of the Hyderabad Literary Festival over the last decade has been its multilingual nature. So, since not everybody in India still speaks Portuguese, I thought I requested Filipa for a translation of that.
No, you do it yourself.
Yes, I will read. Yes, but you gave it to me, right? So, chapter 1, born to be a prime number. George Rouchenol wasn't always George Rouchenol. Up until the 5th of August 1945, he was 7, a prime number. George was the 6th grandchild to be born into the family. His grandfather, Rouchenol, a Galician mathematician with close ties to General Franco, had barely bothered to learn the names of the first 5 by heart. When George was born, awake and without tears, he fixed his grandfather with his mirror-grey eyes that even today are like the waters of 2 mountain lakes that reflect the land back to itself, but in muted tones, or, as George might say, more realistically. The grandfather saw himself in the eyes of his grandson, and to acknowledge, perhaps, because of his own narcissism, that 6 wasn't enough for the unique importance of the newborn. He applied an algorithm and ascribed 7 to him, a prime number, only divisible by 7 or by 1. This was a personality trait that manifested early in George Rouchenol. Not having a natural divisor, he himself was the only point of reference in his measurement system.
Thank you.
May I now invite Lynnette to make her presentation?
Good morning. My name is Lynnette. I'm from Sydney in Australia. I am a writer. I've written 2 novels, and I'm a film producer. I've produced a documentary and a feature film, and I lecture at a university that's just outside of Sydney. My books, I guess they fit this new age idea in the sense that they are alternate histories. I take history and then I mess around with it and change it, and sometimes put myself in it. And this novel, the one I'm talking about today, is called We Ate the Road Like Vultures. And it takes someone in history who's very important to me, and I wrote myself into his story. So I guess what I would say about this book is it was one of those moments that you have as writers, and I'm assuming many of you are writers, where you kind of fall open and the words come out. And it doesn't happen very often, because a lot of the time writing is just hard work and you end up drinking a lot of coffee and surfing Facebook when you should be writing. But this was one of those moments where it just came out. And so it was a joyful experience for me to write it. It's a very strange little book, and I don't really know where it fits into the world of literature, but if you like something really unusual, this is my book. So the story of the book is about a girl called Lulu who is 16 and lives in a small town in Australia. And she doesn't have a very big world, so she reads a lot. And she has a particular writer that she loves his work, like really connects with it. And he's dead, so, she has no way to tell him about this, but she starts to research more about his life, and she finds some writing that sounds like his writing, and she thinks perhaps he's still alive and hiding out in Mexico. She tracks him and she thinks, I'm going to go to Mexico and find out if he's really there. So she runs away from home, leaves everything behind and goes to Mexico and finds this writer, and they end up on a strange road trip adventure together. He's in his 80s and she's 16, and the police are after them, and there's miracles, and there's a strange German man who's following the footsteps of Jesus in Mexico. So it became the adventure that, I wanted to have when I was 16. And I guess the connection to me is that I grew up in Papua New Guinea when I was very little, and it was a very wild place when I was there. Black magic, violence. There was a volcano near us that kept erupting. So I had this very crazy world. And then I moved back to Australia when I was in high school to a very small country town. And I felt like my world just became really small. There was only 4,000 people in the town. And there were 3 schools. There was a public school, and then there was a Catholic school, and then there was this tiny Christian school, which was where my parents were teachers, and so that's the school I had to go to. And this tiny school had an even more small library, and I read everything the first year I was there, and there wasn't very much there. And I felt so stuck and bored. So I went to the town library, and I said to the librarian, I want your biggest book, and I want your craziest book. And I was in I think this was grade 7 or 8, so she was kind. But she gave me Gone with the Wind, because it was 1,010 pages, and I loved it. And then she gave me On the Road by Jack Kerouac. Has anyone read On the Road? Jack Kerouac was an American writer in the 50s and 60s, and one of the really important writers of the beatnik movement. And he absolutely, broke open the world for me, this book. It was like a revelation that you could live like this. He just walked out his door and travelled America, sleeping on trains, getting rides with people. If anything happened, he followed it to see what would happen. And he wrote about it in a stream of consciousness, fast-paced, meandering, alternating between description and action in one paragraph with no punctuation, style of writing that I just loved. I'd never seen anything like it, and I just fell in love with him. And because it was a small country town, I didn't know that he was dead, and I had this imaginary fantasy where I would go and find him. And I knew he would be old, but I thought, I'll go and find him when I'm a bit older, and he's going to teach me everything about writing. I have all these questions. We're going to be best friends. He's going to be my mentor. And then when I found out he was dead, it was a crushing blow to me as a 16-year-old. So much later, I wrote this as my love letter to Jack Kerouac, and it is what I wished had happened, where he didn't die, and I found him in Mexico, and we went on an adventure together. And I tried to write it as though I was still a 16-year-old girl who thought she was a bit like Jack Kerouac, writing kind of like him. I tried to capture that feeling that I had when I was 16, that I kind of knew everything. And so when something happens that you don't understand, it actually is a big blow to you when you're wrong. Whereas when you're a bit older, you're wrong all the time, and you celebrate being wrong because you expand. But when you're 16, being wrong hits you quite hard. So I tried to capture that in here. And the other thing I tried to capture was the way Kerouac would take an image of something that he saw, and it would become central to a part of the story. Some strange image or a strange personality would just waft into his novels, and he'd follow them. And so I brought in all the things that were in my world at the time I was writing this, which was much later, and put them in as well. And so I'm going to read you a part of the first chapter. It's a little bit longer than Filipa's. I hope that's okay. And there's 2 images in here from my world at the time I was writing it. And I'll explain them because they're unusual images. The first is a moose. So a moose, in case you haven't seen one, is an absolutely enormous creature. They're very dangerous. And mostly they live in North America, Canada, Alaska. They've got huge antlers, absolutely enormous feet, kind of a deer-like, except on steroids. And my grandmother-in-law lives in Montana, in America. And she sent us this photo of one of her neighbours up there had a small child swimming pool. You can Google this, it's on the internet, this photo. A small child swimming pool, and in the middle of summer when it was hot, a moose had come and sat down in this child's swimming pool, and everyone in the house was too afraid to go outside because they're really quite cranky, awful creatures. So it was just sitting in their kid's swimming pool. So I loved that image, and I put that in my book, except I put the moose in Mexico, because I thought, why would it be in Mexico? And the other image is of a landmine, and this came from my brother. So at the time I was writing this, my brother was an aid worker in Angola in the war. And every day he lived in a compound, and he had to walk down this dirt road to get to the cars. And their cars were, specially anti-tank cars with anti-tank mine cars with lining underneath. So if they hit a mine, the car would bounce, supposedly. But after this massive rainstorm, all the mud on the path washed away, and this huge landmine came to the surface that he'd been walking over every single day to get to his car, but he wasn't heavy enough to set it off. So obviously they had to have people come in and decommission this mine. So I put that into the story as well. And I'm going to read you part of the first chapter, where Lulu has arrived in Mexico, and she thinks she knows where Jack Kerouac is living in Mexico, and she's come upon this house, and she's about to knock on the door and say, are you one of America's most famous writers who's supposed to be dead, hiding out in the Mexican desert? I think I'll clear it. I knew it was the right place as soon as I saw the giant bull moose up to its hairy antique carpet haunches in a semi-inflated children's swimming pool. Water was sneaking over the side to run for its life into the firebrand sand that hissed and rolled in waves all around the sprawled sunburnt house. The pool was under two of those trees, the type that stagger across the whole of Mexico and cast about as much shade as a Maasai warrior. Buja trees? Bujum? I'd heard the driver of the rattle tin bus say the word at least 100 times during the 6-hour Dust Bowl drive, but he had so few teeth and so much tobacco in his gums I could scarcely figure a word of what he said, except when he told me I owed him $10 just to get off the bus. The moose looked at me with the clear, bright gaze of a being that wished me dead, or was angry at God and the world for allowing it to be so damn hot. He leaned forward a little in what may have been an attempt to rise, leap, and charge me, trampling my thin shrimp taco poisoned frame into the landscape. But the turning of his head caused such a rush of water to make its escape that he turned carefully back to his position, facing the trees, and he left me to my business. My business seemed suddenly a lot more like stalking, the he does love me back kind, than the intelligent discovery that I'd been convincing myself that it was. For the first time in the 6 weeks it had taken me to get from my big, cool home in Chillingham, Australia, to the Baja fry pan of Mexico, I was hesitant about my next course of action. I made the pretense of examining the house for more props for my conclusion, when all I wanted, and at that scattered point needed, was some time to think on what I would say when the door opened. The house was ancient and huge, the type you hear called hacienda in the movies, but without all the care that would ever allow it to be cinematic. It was faded and bits were falling off. Not bits of paint, though that was happening as well, actual bits of the house, which led me to believe it must be made of mud. I was right, and when I found myself with a chunk of it in my hand, I wrapped it in the first thing I pulled from my pack, my last clean pair of underwear. I kept it, not for the money, which it might be worth if I could prove my suspicions, but for the fact that it meant something to me. There were archways all over the place, some of them leading only to other archways, and I expected Zorro to ride through any moment on his stallion, past the scratched guitar leaned against the wall and the whole lot of nothing hanging on the unstrung washing line. And I knew from the nothing and the everything that this was the perfect place to hide, with no trees and just the big old sun to keep your secret, where everyone could see you in plain sight and look straight past. No one would ever look for you here, not in the cliché and the obviousness of it all. It was so quiet out there you could hear the sand shifting, like sitting in a beanbag when you're trying to read a book, but all you can hear is the beans moving around, and it seems like maybe they're coming from inside of your head. The sand was the same, though with the amount of it stuck in my ears, I was wondering if it wasn't really my brain, and the whole thing was just brain sand. I took a few more hesitant steps and heard my rotten sand shoes scuff on something metal, like a piece of spaceship was buried out there in the alien place. And without thinking of danger, I reached down and brushed off the grit in my curiosity to see what was stuck under the sand. It will be hard to convince anyone of what I found down there, but the God-honest truth was that an anti-tank landmine was underneath my foot. A huge thing, the size of my backpack, and I wondered who would have planted such a dangerous, stupid piece of metal in the ground. I knew about these things because my grandfather was at Long Tan and collected all sorts of weapons to hang on his wall in a strange, twisted shrine, and one of those pieces was a decommissioned tank mine, just like the one I was standing on. Whoever'd put it there either didn't know much about it or was hoping only to keep away creatures of extraordinary size, because someone of my weight, or even quite a few kilos heavier, was never going to set off such a powerful piece of machinery. And its proximity to the house showed an equal ignorance, because there was a good chance of some heavy-ass shrapnel peppering those stucco walls if it did go off. I was feeling remarkably unwanted after that little discovery, so it was with great trepidation that I began to think about my next move, be it going ahead to the house or hightailing it back to the bus stop. I was all set back with hesitation, working its way into my brain and making it impossible to get myself going, until I heard the moose breathing a dry and disgusted breath in my direction, and I decided it was only a matter of time and the rising temperature of that water before he bothered to get up and get me the hell off his land. I walked to the huge wooden door with a crusted brass ring from Spain or Portugal that was meant for much softer weather than this and had grown spines and a jagged, angry skin in the heat of its new home. I reached for it, but had to take another step, and my foot pulled on a worn piece of string tied across the front step. It hit the sand and pulled a rusted bell hidden in the cacti at the side of the house, some sort of mad alarm system, which hardly creaked out a sound, but let me know without a doubt that the inhabitants of this place did not want to be crept up on. I didn't think that the noise would waken the spider that rested on the crumbling handle, let alone anyone in the house, but before I could even turn to the door, it was open, and a man the colour and texture of beef jerky was looking down at me with the stare of someone who considered this an interruption he could certainly do without. I stammered and stuttered out my name, Lulu, which I hate, because I'll sound like a child or a Hawaiian dancer till the day I die. But my parents named me for a great-grandmother who discovered some sort of plant back in Wales and who is famous in the world of botany. He yelled back over his shoulder, "We got ourselves a hot little baby out here, Chico, a right gorgeous one." And there was a holler from inside, like someone stricken with emphysema was glad to hear this. And he turned to me and said with the kind of edgy friendliness that told me he might set his moose on me if I didn't turn tail, "What can I do for you, young lady Lulu?" He was straight to the point, and so I thought I should be too, even though I'd hoped to bluff through a conversation with him, or the one inside to see if I was up the garden path or if I'd actually stumbled onto a state secret. "I'm looking for Jack. Does he live here?" That was when the moose charged me, leaping like a stag out of the pool and spraying water and fur into the air as its legs tangled around themselves in the sand, and it snorted towards me, with head down and broken dagger antlers aimed for my chest. I should have moved the hell out of there, but being charged by a 2-ton moose in Mexico was a thought so much out of my head at the time that I did the cliched thing and froze on the spot, waiting for some kind of end to my story. I needn't have worried one scrap about the dripping, snarling creature, because it landed its remarkable body weight on the mine, and the thing went off with a boom that woke the Mexican dead, and sent sand and bits of moose 100 metres into the air, and all over the whitewashed walls, myself and my host. A pair of splintered and evil sharp antlers whirred through the sand cloud past my shoulder, cutting a bit of my skin with a zipping noise. I must have been a cause for laughter and fear, because I was first soaked with moose innards and then stuck with sand from head to foot. I stared up at the man, expecting some sort of energetic reaction to such a tragic loss of his pet, but he simply shook his head. Well, it's his own fault. We told him it was there.
Thank you so much. Wonderful passages, wonderful books, completely unusual, right? A person who turns out to be a prime number that turns out to be a person, a search for someone who's long dead and turns out to be alive, mooses blowing up. 40 minutes is way too little for a session like this. But I'm afraid we're coming to the end of this session. We have time for one question. One. Oops. Yes, sir.
Hi. So I just heard what you were reading. So I found it really interesting the way you have written. I mean, I've read different kind of literature. So sometimes the writer explained too much, you feel, or sometimes it's too fast. But I found that you were making a lot of comments while narrating. Like you talked about reading, sitting in a beanbag, or maybe it's in your head. So is it a deliberate attempt to make some comments, or is it your natural flow? Do you try to follow some norms, or you try to listen to your head? I mean, your inner voice.
In this case, I tried to write every single thought as it came to me. So yes, it was a flow. I know sometimes when I write, though, I have to think and carefully put metaphors in. But this case, I just went, I'm 16, I'm going to say every single thing that I think, like a 16-year-old does. So in this case, yeah.
Yeah, it was a beautiful line, that one. Beanbag.
If it's a really brief question, sir.
I find it a bit difficult. I mean, I enjoyed both presentations, but I find it a bit difficult to see these as examples of New Age. Because when I come to a place and ask for New Age literature, you know what I'm expecting or what people will be showing me. So maybe there's a short comment by the two. What would this be linking to the New Age, as we normally expect it to be in terms of literature in New Age?
I should just say, as a preface, that the rubric New Age, the title was given by the organizers of the conference, of the festival, as a way of bringing two people with vastly different kinds of work together. But if either of you would like to address what makes this New Age, is there any way, briefly?
I don't know if I can help, but when I think in New Age, I think in new fiction or in postmodern fiction. And when you are talking about postmodern fiction, you are not looking for heroes, I think. And the new fictions loves imperfect characters, and because of that, I think it's more human. That is my view of, I don't know if New Age fiction, but new fiction at all.
I would just say that I understand it doesn't feel like New Age writing. What I've done is often called new writing, or new histories as well, where it's a fresh way of writing rather than the traditional interpretation of New Age.
You have several layers, mixing social, political, metaphysical, spiritual issues in the same book, I think.